Support comes from BECU, a member-owned credit union putting people over profit, offering financial services and support to the community with access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs, and online resources at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. Two recent examples show how local law enforcement is still figuring out how to address racism in the ranks. To make it even more complicated, it'll mean a balancing act between free speech rights and trust in the police. We'll talk with KUOW reporter Amy Radil about it in a minute, but first, let's get you caught up. Some teachers and the union that backs them say the governor's order to return to the classroom next month isn't practical. Studies have shown that schools can open safely during the pandemic if the proper precautions are in place. But the Washington Education Association maintains some districts aren't prepared to bring students back safely. School staff members and parents have expressed doubts about protocols and preparation. The governor is expected to sign a proclamation this week ordering districts to offer K through 12 students at least 30% of their instructional time in person, including at least 2 partial days on campus. Hundreds of people came together at Seattle's Hing Park on Saturday, calling for an end to recent attacks on Asian Americans. Speakers included former Governor Gary Locke, former King County Councilman Larry Gossett, current King County Executive Dow Constantine, and a high school teacher at Inglemoor who was recently the victim of a street attack in the ID. Seattle Times says the executive promised more money for education to fight bias crimes in his next budget. There's another rally this afternoon at Renton City Hall. And it could be getting easier for you to start up a home business in Seattle. The city council will vote today on new rules for home businesses after a beloved neighborhood walk-up cider shop was forced to close. A neighbor filed several complaints, and the city determined Yonder Cider's setup ran afoul of several zoning laws. Now the city is considering temporary legislation that would remove some restrictions for home businesses and allow the Greenwood Garage Front Cider Bar to reopen. The King County Sheriff's Office is under fire for how it's handling racially inflammatory social media posts by officers. On Friday, concerned members of the public gathered downtown to draw attention to the issue, and the scrutiny is forcing law enforcement to examine the balance of the civil rights of its officers with the trust of the community. Amy Radil was at the call to action on Friday. Hi, Amy.
Hi there.
So tell me about it. Who was there?
These were people who have had members of their family killed in encounters with police. They've formed groups like Not This Time, and they were pointing out a contrast that they are seeing between two different cases, both determined by the King County Sheriff. She fired one officer over his series of Facebook posts, and then the second officer has been suspended, as they said, for just 1 day without pay.
Okay, so these two deputies are in the same department. They had disparate punishments when it came to racist social media posts. Give me some background on these two deputies.
So one of them is a captain, and that is significant for these family members. This is Todd Miller, who they were talking about. Last spring, he made a post, and this was before the death of George Floyd and the protests starting, but he reposted a story about a bunch of black teenagers in New York who beat and robbed a black 15-year-old girl. And his comment was, "Animals. This is what the inner city gives us these days." And a former colleague filed a misconduct complaint about that post, and Sheriff Mitzi Johanknick has now come up with her decision that it was conduct unbecoming and that Miller should be suspended for a day without pay. The other case is Mike Brown, a deputy who, in his case, he made multiple Facebook posts about things that are very sensitive local issues. One of them was the death of the protester on I-5 who was hit by a car last summer when he repeated this all lives splatter. He also made some posts about the death of Lorenzo Anderson, a black teenager who was killed on Capitol Hill in the Chaz in Seattle. So several posts. Last month, Sheriff Johanknick fired him.
Okay, so social media posts, one deputy gets fired, one gets a suspension, a captain gets a suspension. What are the families we heard from on Friday saying about that?
So the case of Todd Miller is very personal for one family, and that's the family of My Chance Dunlap Gittens. He's a 17-year-old who was killed by King County deputies, including Miller, in 2017. The sheriff has apologized to this family for their son's death, and the county agreed to a settlement where they promised to get body-worn cameras for officers in My Chance's honor. Gittens' mother, Alexis Francois, was there on Friday, and she started by protesting the sheriff's handling of this case against Miller.
I want her to resign. I want Todd Miller to be fired, not promoted. He led that rogue investigation and caused Chance's death. She promoted him. He makes a racist post on social media. He gets suspended for 1 day.
And his involvement in My Chance Gittens' death was the most controversial because people said he really shouldn't have been part of that operation at all because he'd had a very traumatic encounter just 2 days before. He was at the scene when a police officer's son was killed in a hit and run. And they were looking for who had done that hit and run when they created this sting operation that killed My Chance Dunlap Gittens, who had nothing to do with any of that. And people said, Miller shouldn't have been involved because of course you'd be emotional if you had been involved in the kind of case he had been 2 days before that was a family that he knew. So that was already someone that the Gittens family was upset about his role. And now here this month, all these years later, they find out this same person, they knew he'd been promoted, but he'd made this Facebook post calling black teenage boys animals, and their black teenage boy was killed in an action that he was part of.
Very difficult. And Amy, this really gets to a larger issue of how law enforcement contends with racism among officers. What is Sheriff Mitzi Johannick saying right now?
Yeah, officers, they do have policies already in place saying that when you use social media, you're not supposed to post anything that's going to, affect the community trust in the department. So Sheriff Johannick said one of the factors in her decision was the amount of negative attention brought by these posts. In her letter about Miller's discipline, the sheriff said, describing black people as animals is part of the racist history of America. And Captain Miller didn't seem to concede that. He said that he was describing the behavior of the young people. It wasn't about their race. And then the sheriff said that Miller's discipline was lighter than Mike Brown's, the other officer who was fired, in part because his actions really hadn't created as much outrage or been as damaging to the sheriff's office as Brown's had been.
I just want to talk about that for a second because it sounds like what the sheriff said is that discipline gets determined by how much attention a case gets.
Yeah, I can read to you from her letter. And this is her letter where she explains why she fired Mike Brown. And then she talks about suspending Todd Miller. And she wrote, this was because there was not the outrage and extremely harmful, negative, and damaging effect to the sheriff's office that your posts, Mike Brown, and comments created locally and nationwide. But these family members are outraged. They only learned of it now. No one could be outraged before because people weren't aware of his social media post or of the investigation that was taking place.
We're also waiting, Amy, to find out more about 6 Seattle police officers who attended the January 6th Stop the Steal rally and whether they took part in the assault on the U.S. Capitol.
This week, we could see the release of those officers' names. The officers have gone to court to try to prevent that because SPD's internal investigation is still taking place. But those names could come out ahead of the investigation findings. Right after that siege at the U.S. Capitol, the numbers started trickling out about how many Seattle police officers were in Washington, D.C. that day. 2 officers were reported by one of their own colleagues, and then 4 others self-reported that they had been at this rally. All 6 of those officers are being investigated. They all admit to being there, but they've all said that they did not go inside the Capitol building or break any laws, have any part in the siege. Andrew Meyerberg is in charge of this investigation at the Office of Police Accountability, and this is what he told the city's Community Police Commission back in January.
Officers do have a First Amendment right to have political beliefs and go to rallies. And I just want to be really careful because I've seen kind of the drumbeat on Twitter to call for the termination of these officers immediately. It's not going to happen. If they violate the law, for sure, there will be consequences.
Amy, I wonder more broadly speaking if you expect anything to change about how police officers are allowed to express their political views.
It's going to be contentious. I mean, to be clear, this is about what officers are doing when they're off duty. That's what all these cases involve. But of course, the family of My Chance Dunlap Gittens says hearing Todd Miller's post feels very relevant to how he perceives Black youth, how he interacts with them when he's on the job. A lot is happening right now at the state legislature to require officers to intervene when they see misconduct by a fellow officer. We might see more screening of officers' social media when they're first hired. There's even a proposal to let members of the public file complaints to the state about things that they're upset about. They even gave the example of people who have Confederate flags in their yard. Fred Thomas was there on Friday. He's the co-founder of Next Steps Washington. His son, Leonard Thomas, was killed in 2013, and he begged the public to join with these families and speak up if they are upset about these kinds of cases.
If it's only impacted families who have lost someone speaking, they're going to try to wait us out. But if the good officers, if the good people of King County speak up loud enough, we will have change. We will let everybody in this nation know Washington is not a place for racists.
Amy, a larger call for community action there, not just from affected families and in some cases, officers coming forward. What can we expect to see?
There's a lot in flux right now. There are changes coming to the King County Sheriff's Office this year because voters changed the sheriff's position from elected to appointed last year. And these families who spoke Friday are going to be part of choosing this new appointed sheriff by next year. But Mitzi Johanknick says she is duly elected to serve through the end of this year. She has no plans to resign. And yeah, just to note that it was a former colleague who filed the complaint about Todd Miller's Facebook post that prompted the investigation. So there are clearly people within law enforcement who are upset by his sentiments and want to see changes as well.
All right, KUOW's Amy Radil, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Seattle Now is produced by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, Clare McGrane, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.